Good morning, my name's Will Smith. I'm going to be talking about physical materials and notch. Did anyone come to yesterday's talk on lighting at all? A few of you? So this is going to be following a similar theme, but we're going to be diving into materials in a bit more depth. So there will be a lot of similar things in this talk. So let's get started. So the presentation today, Let's Get Physical, is about physically based rendering and understanding how materials work in Notch. I'll be presenting the talk, and I have Adrian Ravelli here with me, who is another project specialist who started at the company at the same time I did. Adrian's been working on most of the scenes we're going to be looking at today and showing in this presentation. He'll also be helping me out during the presentation and answering questions at the end if you have any technical questions on things like substance design and things like that. So I'm going to skip through this a bit. If people were at yesterday's talk, basically I came from a games background working in the Unreal Engine. My experience with real-time games is really helpful to Notch, and that's why I joined the team. So for this talk, we're going to go through these subjects and these workflows. So we're going to go through what physically based rendering is. We're going to be taking a look at lighting. We're going to be looking at the world of materials. We're going to be looking specifically at the importance of roughness and metallicness textures. We're going to be looking at base color, ambient occlusion, and normal textures as well near the end of the talk. So this scene was built by Adrian. This isn't an offline render. This is running real time. Well, this is obviously a 2D render of the scene, but this scene runs pretty quick. We're going to release this scene later in the year so that you guys can take the assets and take a look at how we put it together. So that will be coming out in a couple of months, I think. So this scene, it looks great. It looks photorealistic. The materials respond well. It looks like it should look if it was a real-life scene. The metals reflect and shine as they should do. The woods and the croissants, they're a lot duller. They reflect the light differently. Excuse me. All the materials in the image work well, and they look correct. All the assets in the scene are using PBR materials, physically based rendering, that mimic how materials work in the real world. So what is physically based rendering, or PBR? Physically based rendering is a method of shading and rendering that provides a more accurate representation of how light interacts with surfaces. It's a technique that mimics the real-world materials more accurately. We use this technique so that our materials have more realistic responses in real time. But to better understand PBR, we need to understand how lighting actually affects materials in the real world. So in this image, the sphere gives off a different material response from the left to the right. The objects on the right are rougher compared to the objects on the left are rougher than the objects on the right. As you can see, the rougher materials on the left-hand side are scattering the light more than the materials that are like a mirror finish on the left, on the right. Oh, sorry, I'm getting confused with my left and my right. It's looking back. When materials hit when light hits the materials on the right, because it's a mirror finish, the light is scattered less, and so looks more reflective. So how are these light rays interacting with the surface? On a very basic level, a rough surface has less light reflected because the light gets lost in the small pits and dents that are within that surface. That light gets bounced back out and scattered, so it looks less reflective, and the light physically doesn't return to your eyes, not so much if it returns back to your eyes. A hard, shiny surface reflects nearly all of the light back towards your eyes with only minimal light loss. Examples of rough materials include things like rock, things like rust, cloth, rubber, dusty things. They all have micro pitting in the surface, meaning that the light hitting the surface scatters rather than being reflected straight back. Harder surface include polished marble, metals, glass, plastics. These surfaces have less pitting in the surface, so the light reflected back looks shinier. So objects with one material tend to have the same roughness throughout the whole surface, but there are occasions where the roughness values of the materials changed over the surface. For example, on this metal ball, it's got rust on it. So the roughness in those areas are going to be duller than the roughness of the metal, the actual original metal. If an object has scratches on it or wear on it, it will uncover the underlying metal on a dull metal, and then there will appear highlights and brightness of reflection in those areas. So areas of rust are more pitted, therefore reflect less. Areas of the pure metal reflect more, so your texture, your roughness texture will be different in those areas. So now we're going to look at roughness surface. The roughness of your material basically comes down to how hard, how smooth the surface is. A hard polished ball will reflect most of the light, making the surface look shiny. A soft furry ball, like the one on the right, will absorb most of the light. Thus, it will look less reflective. But even though this fluffy ball on the right-hand side will be very dull and less reflective, it will still have some shine to it. So there's pretty much no materials that don't have some kind of reflectiveness on them. So this brings us to metallicness and roughness. This notch scene shows the same sphere with different materials on it, on a gradient. We have a sliding scale of roughness and metallicness on each sphere. From back to front, the roughness goes from 0 for no roughness, which is black, which is a mirror finish. And it goes to 1, which is a rough, dusty, coal kind of finish, something that really absorbs the light or scatters the light. From left to right, the metallicness goes from 1 for full metal to 0 to no metal at all. So regarding metal settings, metal should, in the real world, an object should really be a metal object or 0 metal for something that is not metal. Although things like glass and water don't really follow these trends in a real-time engine. So you may want to add a little bit of metal to some surfaces like that to help you get the look you're looking for. So a little bit of artistic license, just to bring things up a little bit. So for instance, things like plastic, you may want to add a little bit of metal in there just to punch out the reflections a little bit more. So now we're going to dive into materials and look at how these rules are applied to this scene. So we're going to take the coffee grinder as our model. We're going to look at it as a case study. We're going to look at how to set up the material IDs. We're going to look at how to set up the UVs. I'm going to show you how to create the PBR texture maps, and we're also going to show you how to use high poly information to render off information for the low poly model in the form of normal maps and ambient occlusion maps. So, setting up the material IDs on an object. For this, you need to do it in an exterior 3D application. I usually use 3D Studio Max. It's my preferred modeling application. The first thing to decide is what your model is made from. How many materials are on that object. Obviously, the coffee grinder, if you saw it in the last image, is mainly made from wood and metal. So we split these materials up. The polygons that are wood, I've set to green for a visual reference. It could be any color. And all the polygons that we want to be metal, I've highlighted in blue, just to give you a visual reference so you know the polygons are on the right surface type. So after we've created our low poly mesh, we need a UV map. We need a UV map so that we can create the textures for the actual low poly object. So for the coffee grinder, we've created on the left-hand side a unique UV map. So what do I mean by a unique UV map? Basically, all the polygons on the surface of the object will have their own unique texture space on the texture. So the reason we do things like this is it just means that there'll be no errors when we try and render off an ambient occlusion map. There'll be no errors when we take it into Notch for things like shadowing, if we ever want to bake in shadows, things like that. It's just a better practice to have unique UVs on objects that you're building. So here are the metal and roughness maps. They don't really look like anything special. I'm going to describe why they both look like how they are up there. When the metal map is created, the areas that are metal on the texture should generally be white that are metal on the surface. The areas of the object that are not metal, for instance the wood, that should be set to non-metallic, which will come out black. As you notice on the left-hand side on the texture, there are areas that are grey on the actual metal rather than being full white for metal. These are areas of things like rust, dirt, grime that we wanted to include on the actual texture just to push the texture a little bit more. So then we look at how to set up the roughness map. So on the roughness map, the metal should be slightly less rough than the wood surface. So the metal areas will be slightly darker, and the wood texture should be slightly lighter. The reason it isn't so dark, the wood isn't so dark on this texture, is because we wanted to make it look a little bit shiny. So if it's shiny, it's going to be harder, so a harder material, so it will appear slightly darker. So that's why there isn't much variation between the two textures, or materials, sorry. So this is the roughness map actually applied to the coffee grinder. The roughness map shouldn't contain any shadow detail when it's created. Areas that look like they're shadowing are actually areas where we wanted to add dirt. So that's not actually shadowing under those areas. It's dirt and grime where the surface had been worn on the to give the polished look on the faces, and then areas that were dirty and grimy where dirt would collect they obviously look like shadowing there, but they're not. The roughness map should have no baked shadows of any kind in it, although it's a good idea to add areas where there is pitted, just to have it a little less rough, just to pull out the surfaces compared to the edge edges. It just helps you set the shape of the actual object. The roughness map should have a relatively flat colour, or it should be a relatively flat look throughout. But for a little artistic license, you can add things like the actual grain for the wood. You see on the front, we've actually got some of the text detail of the actual label on the front of the metal thing. This just adds extra highlights to those areas so they ping out a little bit more. So now we're going to look at the metal map and what it looks like on the coffee grinder. As you can see, the metal map only shows up on the areas where the metal is. So you can see the top of the coffee grinder, the handles, the badge, they're all metal. Everything that isn't metal is black. So all of the wood is set to black on this. So we're going to look at the rest of the materials or textures that were used in this on this scene. Sorry about the lighting on this. That is actually a normal map there, but the projector's quite bright, so it's bleeding out a little. It looks better over there. Look that way. So we have a color map, which is also known as base color or albedo. RGB, it's an RGB texture. We have our ambient occlusion map. This map adds subtle shadowing to the actual model. We have our normal map, and this adds all your extra details like bumps and dents on the actual flat surfaces of the model. So we're going to look at our color map next. So here's the color map, and this is on the coffee grinder model. So it's important when you're producing a color map or a albedo map that it should be free of shadowing. It shouldn't have any specular highlights. It shouldn't have any ambient occlusion on it. It should be basically the raw material of what your material looks like. So for metals, we've got a sort of raw grey colour for the actual wood. It's just the grain of the wood and not much else. So you can include smaller details like wood grain, things like that, metal surface scratches or dirt to this texture, but you don't want any highlighted detail like reflections, or you don't want any shadow detail, because that will not work well when you actually make your material. Another thing is, when you create this map, it's a good idea to make this texture as noiseless as possible. So what do I mean by that? If the contrast of this was ramped up anymore, when you add it to your material, it wouldn't work. The shadows wouldn't highlight so well. The reflections wouldn't work so well. It wouldn't work at all. So try and make your color maps, try and reduce the noise from your color maps, as that will help the shadowing and reflections work better. So now we're going to move on to high poly baking. So for the coffee grinder, we had an original high poly mesh that we started off with. A lot of people work in that way. They'll build a high poly mesh and then produce their low poly mesh from it. The high poly mesh is a good mesh to help generate the normal map and the ambient occlusion textures from. I'll go into that in more detail in the next slide. So this is the ambient occlusion map. It's applied to the 3D object. It's been created using the high poly version of the mesh and baking the high poly details onto the low poly model to create the ambient occlusion texture, which is using the UV layout of the low poly mesh. Now, things like this have to be done in your in a 3D package outside Notch before you bring it in. So this can be done in several ways. I use 3D Studio Max to do this. I baked the ambient occlusion map out using V-Ray. V-Ray is really good at creating those ambient occlusion maps. So why do we have the ambient occlusion map? Because it adds subtle shadowing, and it helps ground surfaces. It helps ground objects to the surface they're sitting on. It also helps add depth to the object, adding smaller details, shadowing around things like the plate on the front. You can see you've got the details around the handle on the front of the drawer. It just helps punch the object a little bit more and make it feel more three-dimensional. And also using the details from the high poly mesh, it adds the extra details to the low poly mesh that you wouldn't be able to model. So this is the normal map applied to the low poly 3D object. This has been created using the same technique as produced in the ambient occlusion map. So the final normal map basically fakes the surface of the low poly mesh, so it looks higher poly than it actually is. This is great because you can save a lot of performance issues if you create your objects like this. You can also add additional details to the low poly mesh that are too expensive or too hard to model, things like bumps, scratches, things like that, and dents. So what next? So now we're now going to look at a Substance Designer integration. So we're going to look at, obviously Notch is now fully compatible with Substance materials. So in this short clip, we're going to look at how to create and export Substance materials from Substance Designer, and then how to import those materials into Notch. Okay, so here's a short video. So this is a video Adrian did before. In this video, he's setting up so he's importing the substance material straight into Notch. So with substance materials, you can just import them straight into Notch, drag them straight into your node graph, and plug them straight into your object. All he had to do here was turn on environment mapping to get the actual material to work. So the integration is pretty quick. So now we're going to look at creating a masterpiece in Notch. And we're going to look at the substance workflow. So in this short clip, we're going to show you how to create textures in Substance Painter. So to do this, Adrian's going to set up he's going to set up one of the templates in Substance Painter, which is a metal roughness template. He's going to set the resolution for the materials and import his low poly mesh. Once he's imported this low poly mesh, he's going to use the high poly mesh to bake in details for the ambient occlusion and normal maps. And he'll set up all the texture resolutions for that. And this is baking it all in. I should have probably cut this bit, but this is real time, so it's quite a quick process. It's nearly done. Right, so here is your ambient occlusion texture, and the normal map has also been generated. And after he's done this, he's going to take some of the default materials from Substance Painter and apply them to the low poly mesh. So I think these are all default materials that he's adding here. He's going to look at a material which has some wear and tear on it, another wood material in a second. So this is applying the materials to the low poly mesh. And then he's going to add a metallic material. So this metallic material will be for all the metallic bits. Once he's done that, he's going to bring in a mask. Now this mask, this color mask, will define where the metal areas of the object should be and where the wood areas of the object should be. And once he's applied it, you'll see that the areas, you can see the blues are the metal, and I think it was yellow as the wood area. So once he's applied that, you can see that he's got the right materials onto the proper sections of the mesh. And then he's going to very quickly finish the model. There you go. Boom. That was quicker. So that's a bit more polished. Thank you for that, Adrian. So now, and then he's going to export it. Right, so now we're going to go on to the Notch workflow and show how to bring those textures back into Notch. This is bringing the textures back into Notch. We've turned on deferred rendering, high dynamic range, and anti-aliasing in the actual scene. Here he's bringing in the low poly mesh and FBX, brings it into the node graph, and then he's going to add a light to that scene. Connect that up. And there's the object. This has got no materials on yet. So now he's going to add a material to the scene and hook that material up to the low poly mesh. These are the textures that are going into that material. So you bring them in, select the material, and then you'll have these boxes down the side, and he'll bring in the corresponding textures to the corresponding slots. So you bring in the color map, you bring in the normal map, roughness map texture, and the metallic texture. And then both the metallicness and roughness need to be dialed up to 1, and then you add a tick box in the environment mapping so we can get some environment mapping work on it. So he's brought in the environment mapping. He's going to add a HDR image to that environment map. And the reason we're doing this is just so you get a bit more reflection so you can see the metallics and the metals working better. So that's how quick it is to bring the textures in and set an object up. So here are some images of the final scene. This is what it looks like. All those processes were done on every object in the scene. So they all went through exactly the same process with the normal mapping, with the high poly meshes, with baking the ambient occlusion in. And here's another angle of it. Does everyone like this? Does it look real? Does it look... Pardon? Yeah, it's fantastic. But this is the kind of stuff we've done. This is early stages for us using things like this, and it's only going to get better and more realistic. So we're sort of really pushing the boundaries with this tech at the moment. And once we start bringing ray tracing into it as well, it's just going to get better and better. It's going to look awesome. So I'm really excited. And I haven't played with ray tracing yet, so that'll be Monday morning. I'm going to open up Notch and start playing with ray tracing. So, any questions?
See, the version that you're using to do this demo, this is not a version that's available to us at the moment, right?
It will be soon.
You've got your index of refraction options in there, your material list that we don't have anymore.
I don't think it's different. This isn't using any new stuff, apart from... Is it?
No.
No. Yeah, we should be able to get this out to you guys. I'm not sure when yet. We were planning to do it today, but we realised the build that would come with it would have a few other things on it that aren't ready yet. So it is, maybe we could get it on an earlier build or something, I don't know. But yeah, it will be available to you soon.
In the examples you showed today, yesterday, it's always square resolutions on your textures, so 4K by 4K or...
Yes, yes.
Quite often, obviously, in the disguise detail show a big aspect of the screen not square. Quite often the resolutions are non-square.
Yeah.
In substance, and how does it affect the sort of performance having non-square textures?
How does it affect the performance? I don't know.
You mean like on your UV maps?
Yeah, on the UV maps. The actual resolutions of textures.
I think you can have non-square textures in Notch. I've used them a lot. I don't know how it affects the performance, though.
There's no cost.
No.
There's always been that discussion about you need to have square resolution.
It was mainly, yeah,
Obviously, in the D3 show, it's never, ever square resolution.
yeah.
Yeah. But your textures generally, because they're not the aspect really. Oh, I see what you mean.
If you want to texture your screen, you know what I mean, a very cinematic screen, for example, or a crazy shaped screen,
Yeah.
you can actually texture it in Notch to replay back later on.
Would you not usually be texturing your objects and be then that square?
But you still, you want to keep, you don't want to use the screen is very, very cinematic. You don't want to put square resolution because it's a lot of dead space in UV.
But the textures can have an independent aspect ratio.
Yeah.
Which is not into skies. Those can be different.
Yeah, I don't think your texture will just be squashed down into a square plane. I think the square will have all the UVs squashed into it differently, if you know what I mean. It will take the resolution of the full texture. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more.
Yep.
So Bill, you mentioned, you bake your ambient occlusion on a high poly model,
Yes,
and then you convert it into a low poly model.
yes.
How do you, I mean, you obviously do that in 3D Max.
Yep.
I have no experience with 3D Max. I suppose there's like create low poly button.
No,
But
it's definitely not.
how do you prevent your UV maps to get broken when you kind of convert it into a low poly?
You don't have UV maps on your high poly mesh. You don't need them. So you always create UVs on your low poly mesh. But there are techniques, if you do have a high poly mesh with a UV that you want to use, there are techniques you can use to do it. It's mainly taking out the edges and things like that, or if you move polygons in Studio Max, you'd have a button where it would say keep UVs the same, and you select that, so when you move things about, the UVs stay the same. So if you stretch a polygon or an... There is, but yeah, it's trial and error. Usually it's best if you have a high poly mesh to just redo the UVs at the end. Unless it's something you've bought and you want to keep those UVs, then you'll have to get in there and do it manually and just keep an eye on them as you go through it. And there may be times where you just have to re-UV sections of your actual mesh. So if you reduce the polys down, say on the wheels of a car, but you've got the UVs of the body, you keep the UVs of the body, but then you have to remake the UVs of your wheels. So it's all trial and error, back and forth, and there's no magic button. But it will still save you loads of time if you buy something.
And how does the high poly model know where the ambient occlusion needs to go unless it has a UV?
No, it uses the UVs of the low poly model. Yeah, it doesn't use the UVs of the high poly model.
So I create the UV on the low poly
Yes,
before
yeah.
I bake the ambient
Yes, yep. So UV's always gone the low poly models. That's how it's always been read, yes.
And what resolution are these textures?
Uh,
So I understand the golden nugget scenario, but I'm not actually sure how
I think these are all 2K, are they?
Okay.
Yeah, 2K and 4K, these ones. You can go up to 8K, but it's all about, it uses up a lot of memory if you use loads of really high resolution textures. It also, it takes a long time to load. So you want to be as optimal on textures as you are with the actual mesh as well. So it's basically looking at the objects in your scene. If they look blurry, up the resolution. Well, no, you'd start higher. Always start high with your textures and then reduce them down until it looks okay. So it's all about eyeballing your scene.
We were looking into Unreal recently, and there's an example of the Eiffel Tower,
Yep,
where they suggest cut in 3 parts,
yes.
right? And then so it doesn't render, or it
Yep.
renders out. So is there anything like that in Notch that we should be aware of? If you've got a big object, kind of make it into different...
Yeah,
texture maps?
I think with Unreal that's so that the polygons or the bits of the Eiffel Tower aren't drawn. If you have the whole Eiffel Tower on, if you just look at the bottom section, the whole thing's still being drawn. So I don't know how that works.
That's polycoloring though, isn't it?
Yeah, and if we've got polycoloring anyway, haven't we? Or
Yeah,
something?
so it's less to do with textures, just more to do with they don't want to be rendering three meshes at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're just looking at the base, you're only rendering the base, it's not rendering the top objects. But we have various types of colour, for sure, but you don't really need to do like that.
Yeah. Was it just to keep the texture resolution up?
Well,
With-
I understood it was basically one big texture map. It's got
Oh, right.
all
Yeah.
texture
Yeah.
maps,
Yeah.
show it a bit.
Yeah.
You only take the texture map from the top part and just say,
No, that is a good idea, even a Notch to do that, because otherwise you'd be using massive textures where you could probably just use a 2K texture on the bottom, 2K on the middle, 2K on the top, and that's going to be loads less than the 4K just doing that. If anyone's got any more questions, just come and see me. I'll be wandering around the rest of the day. I hope that you enjoyed that. Right, thank you very much. Cheers, thank you.